Hypocrisy for the ages, coming at you from Washington State University. Good old Wazoo! Beat those Huskies. And with the coming of fall and the beginning of school, we get, of course, academic hypocrisy. We get the crazy lunatics that run our universities. Multiple professors at Washington State University have explicitly told their students in their syllabi and opening materials that their grades will suffer if they use such terms as illegal alien, male, and female, or if they fail to defer to non-white students. This is unbelievable. Washington State University now legislating how people react to their fellow students. Take Selena Lester-Brex. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Professor of Gender Studies. Now, why are we surprised, Sparky, that yet another gender studies professor is engaging in sexist, racist, intolerant behavior? What is it with that discipline? I mean, are there no boundaries? According to the syllabus for Selena Lester-Brex, quote, the title of the course is Women in Popular Culture. That's one you want to set aside a lot of money. You want to spend a lot of time, don't you, Spark, building your IRA so that one day your kid could take a class on women in popular culture, spend lots of money. That's wonderful, right? According to the syllabus for Selena Lester-Brex, Women in Popular Culture class, students risk, listen to this, a failing grade if they use any language that she, in all her omnipotence, deems oppressive and hateful language. Isn't that nice? That as a professor, I ought to start doing that. Anybody who uses scare quotes in class, Sparky, I ought to fail them, right? Because that bothers me. I find that offensive. Right? Anybody who uses the term patriarchy, anybody who in class uses the term patriarchy, we're going to dock them for hateful speech. We're going to fail them because, oh my God, you're lumping 50% of the entire human population for the last 10,000 years together in that name. It is the ultimate uber stereotype. Do I get to pull that off, Spark? You think they'd let me do that on campus? Not too sure about that. Students lose 1 point every time they use the words illegal alien or illegals rather than her politically correct term, undocumented migrants, immigrants, or persons, all right? So we've got a one-man language police here. We've got a woman who decides, because she gets to teach a college class, that she can authoritatively and without any consequence enforce this kind of language Nazism. And then you've got my personal favorite, Professor John Streamus, also from good old Wazoo. In fact, Washington State University, WSU. He at one time referred to Washington State University, this lefty, as white supremacist university. Isn't that wonderful? How does that, that's one of the joys of tenure. I get tenure, I understand it, tenure's important. But what does it do? It allows radical lefties on campus to pretty much say anything they want. John Streamus is a classical example. You've got one of the most liberal college campuses in America, which is hard to narrow that down. But at Washington State University, you can get away with doing things like John Streamus does, and yet Streamus still sees them as a bunch of Nazis. He called them Washington, or white supremacist university. He's a professor, there you go, he's a professor of ethnic studies at good old Wazoo, all right? Gender studies, we had a trend happening here, don't we? Gender studies, ethnic studies, pride groups on campus. Seems to be an awfully vocal and dominant constituency for groups that consider themselves minorities. But in any event, this professor of ethnic studies said, among other things, called them Washington White Supremacist University. Also at Washington State, white students in Professor John Streamus's Introduction to Multicultural Lit class. That's another one you want to get going on those two kids of yours, Spark. Set some money aside so they can take a class like this. Introduction to Multicultural Literature class are expected to, quote, defer, unquote, to non-white students if they want to do well in this class. Let's just pause there for a second. On this man's syllabus, he tells kids, as a requirement of the class, white students must defer to the experience of non-white students if they expect to do well. The only way you're going to do well as a white student in the very white Mr. Streamus's class. Love the medallion, by the way. I bet he was something in the 70s. Would love to see the mood ring. In this guy's class, unless you defer to the experience of people of color, you risk failing the course. You understand what that means? That if you have a point that you'd like to put forward in class, and a non-white person has a point that they put forward, you can't argue, you can't debate, you can't respectfully engage each other from different perspectives. You, as the white kid, must defer. So whatever is said by a person of, and how do we define person of color? What does that mean? How do we define that? Well, I would imagine Mr. Streamus himself would decide that. I decide. Isn't it amazing that more often than not in these situations, what you have are the whitest of white people using language and speech codes and threatening failure to protect other groups, right? Who has the power here? Who are the ones doing this? In his syllabus, Streamus requires students to, quote, reflect, unquote, on their grasp of history by deferring to the experiences of people of color. So in his class, the only way you are adequately understanding history, the only way you are on the right path to success in his class is if you defer to the experiences of people of color. It is absolutely astounding that you are simply on the basis of race, which haven't we learned over the last few months that race doesn't mean any. Who's this person in charge of an NAACP group? Remember that woman who was in charge of in charge of an NAACP group who turned out to be totally white? Yeah, right. And then her defenders, her liberal defenders came out and said, well, she identifies as white. It's a lot like Bruce Jenner. He identifies as a woman, so we got to call him a her. That's fine if that's the way it works. But how does it not work this way? Aren't we all people of color that way? I mean, white's a color, isn't it? I mean, different shades of white, from the pink hues of the Irish to the dusky white of the Greeks. And I mock here. Because what in the world does white male mean? Or what in the world does white people signify? Is a 2nd century BC Greek and a 19th century Norwegian and a 20th century American, these are all white males, right? They couldn't have anything less in common. Less in common. Who has less in common than a Viking, an Aristotle, and a World War I doughboy? Who has less in common than those things? And yet they're all white males, and so therefore we can treat them with impunity. This is the hypocrisy, the inconsistency, and the absurdity that comes with liberal academia today. Streamus goes on, and this gets me. This is the guy screaming for tolerance, screaming for inclusion, screaming for absolute surrender in the face of politically correct tolerance that's going to bring us a utopia that leads to a loving rainbow. You know what I notice about the rainbow, Spark? There is no white in the rainbow. That's what makes it so appealing to the left, right? You've got all the colors of the rainbow. Oddly, the white is left. You get the imagery, don't you? It's going to be the new way of justifying all this. But this denizen of higher ed, this great supporter of the rights of all, this man who's so sensitive about language, he once previously generated controversy by calling a student, quote, a white bag. Spark, I'm going to repeat that. A white bag. That's what Professor Streamus, tenured Professor Streamus, actually called a student in one of his classes. We had mentioned before, this denizen of academia also referred to Washington State University as white supremacist university. So let me ask you a question there, Spark. He's a white guy claiming that his university supports white supremacy, and yet he hasn't given up tenure in protest. He hasn't walked. Think about that. If I worked for an organization that I believed was white supremacist neo-Nazi, and my response to that was not to quit because you're paying me and can't fire me, doesn't that make me a white supremacist too? Isn't he guilty of the same thing? Quit, walk away, give up tenure, John. But no. He gets to call them white supremacists, and he gets to refer to students as, are you ready, Spark? White bags, without any consequence whatsoever. He also demands that, quote, students understand and consider the rage of people who are victims of systematic injustice. In other words, if there's a raging, angry person in class who happens to be a different color, you have to take it. If somebody in class who is considered a person of color is ranting, raving, spitting, screaming, shouting, impugning, if that's going on, as a white person, you have to show understanding of that rage, that irrationality, that anger. You have to take the insults if they're thrown your way. Because these people, well, their ancestors a few hundred years ago anyway, may have been subject to some sorts of violence or injustice. The irony of this, let me simply point out here that one of the hallmarks of the modern academic, the modern professor, the modern academic these days, is there's no sense of humor. And there is absolutely no sense of irony. We ought to go back to teaching literary terms, right? What irony means, right? What hyperbole means. And maybe they'd see just how out of line with what they preach a lot of what they preach to themselves is. And that's round 3.